Now, before we get into ASP.NET Ajax, I would like to make sure everyone is comfortable with the primitives that are involved with building Ajax-style applications. So we're going to start with an example of an application that's not using any libraries. It's just using client-side script, the XML/HTTP/Request object, and the document object model to manipulate client-side elements. So let me go ahead and drop into this demonstration here. The code for this demo, by the way, you can download in the associated demo link with this module. So let me go ahead and just run the application first so you can get a sense for what it does. All we have is a page here with a bunch of markup on it, but I have a little bit of interactivity over here on the right, where if I type in a name of an instructor, I can click on the Find button. And notice when I click on the Find button, you're not going to see any postback going on here because we're doing an asynchronous callback. So that's an example of using the XML/HTTP/Request object to respond to client-side interaction without going through the traditional postback model. So every time I type in a name here and click on the Find button, that initiates an asynchronous call back to the server, and then when I get the data back on the client, I dynamically populate this div element right here using the document object model. So let's take a look at how this is built. Now this is built with an ASP.NET page right here, but again, I'm not using any of the ASP.NET Ajax features, just to show you what's necessary at the lowest levels. So to begin with, I've created a client-side script block here, and inside of the script block, I've created a variable definition called XML/HTTP, and what I'm going to do is populate this variable with the XML/HTTP/Request object. So this is that object that gives us asynchronous callbacks to the server, or gives us the capability to do that. Now, the way we're going to create this object is a bit dependent on which browser you're currently running in. So we've tried to do this in a slightly more browser-independent way by creating our own little wrapper function called createXML/HTTP/Rec object, which will go and instantiate the object based on the browser type. So first of all, we check to see if there's an ActiveX control. If it is, we know we're in IE, and we can use this to instantiate the XML/HTTP/Request object. If it's not, perhaps there is a global XML/HTTP/Request object available, as there is in Firefox, and actually now there is in IE7 as well. And I'm going to do it this way by calling new on that object. Otherwise, I may call createRequest, which I believe is an Opera syntax for creating the object. So this should cover 90% of the browsers that support this, and give us a slightly less browser-dependent application. This is a good example, by the way, of things that libraries will help you with. So once you start working with ASP.NET Ajax, you will no longer have to worry about the details of instantiating XML/HTTP/Request, because that happens implicitly for you in the libraries, and it will be done in a browser-independent way. So if you're looking at this code and beginning to cringe, just remember it's going to go away eventually. Okay, so let's drop down to the markup here so you can see what's going on. Here's that piece of interaction that I was showing you. I've got an input element, just a client-side input, a server-side input element, whose identifier is text instructor name, and then I have a button, and the button, I have a client-side click property that I've initialized to this chunk of JavaScript here, which is going to return true or false based on the result of this function call, client-side instructor info _ click. And then finally, we have a div down here that we're going to use to populate the results. So print out the information about the instructor. That's the idea. Okay, so let's look at a couple things. Let's go up to this function right here, client-side instructor info _ click, because that's what's going to launch the whole thing. So here's that function, client-side instructor info click. The first thing I want to point out here is in this function, I will either return true if there is no client-side XML/HTTP/Request object, or I will return false if I did manage to create it and launch the asynchronous request. Now, what's interesting about this is if I return true, that will tell it to continue with the post back. So if we go back down here, this button is an ASP.NET server-side button. Will initiate a server-side post back when this is clicked if your client-side function returns true. But I'm only going to return true if there is no client-side XML/HTTP/request object. And if there is none, what I'm going to do is drop back to my server-side code here and basically provide the same implementation as my client-side code, or the callback function, in my ASP.NET page. So this is an example of where I'm trying to support clients that have the XML/HTTP/request object, as well as potentially those that don't. Okay, so let's go back up to that function again. So as long as I created the object and that worked fine, I'm going to then retrieve the value from the instructor name input element by calling document.getElementById. That's an example of using the client-side DOM to interact with the user's input. And as long as the value was non-null, or it wasn't an empty string, I'm going to call the open method on the XML/HTTP/request object. And here's where you specify what verb you want to use to initiate the call, as well as what endpoint you want it to map onto. And notice here I'm mapping onto an endpoint called getInstructorInfo.ashx, which is a custom handler I have built here. And I'm passing via a query string the value of the instructor name, so I can pull out the right chunk of information on that instructor. And then I wire up an event handler. So this is an asynchronous call. We're going to have to be notified when the call completes, and that's what we're doing here. We're setting up the onReadyStateChange function to be equal to a handler function that we're writing that's going to be called once this thing has completed its execution. And here's how you initiate it. So this is a XML HTTP request method called send, and it's going to invoke this endpoint, call this endpoint using this verb, and then call us back on this update function. Okay, then we return false to preempt the post back, so it doesn't do the traditional post back. And then finally, here's the callback function. This is where all the actual updating happens. So in the callback, we check to see if the request object is in the proper state. 4 is the completed state. And we also check the status to make sure it was a proper HTTP response code. We're looking for 200 in this case. And if both of those things are true, that means we're completed and we completed successfully. So I'm going to pull out the response from the XML/HTTP/request object and populate that response into the inner HTML property of the div that I'm saving to display instructor information. And that's pretty much it. So the one other piece to show you here is the implementation of this server-side endpoint, the ASHX endpoint. And as I mentioned, this is just a straightforward ASP.NET handler implementation, sort of the rawest implementation of an endpoint you can build in ASP.NET. And all it does is implement the process request method to look at the incoming request's query string for the instructor, sets the response type to text and plain, and then checks the instructor to see if it equals one of these two strings that are coded. Otherwise, we just send back a little chunk of markup that says we don't know anything about that instructor. And here we're just sending back a string that we're going to inject into the inner HTML element or property of the div. So that's pretty much it. Very simple example, but this really incorporates several elements that you'll see in a lot of Ajax applications, including the XML/HTTP/request object. So we use that to perform an asynchronous callback, some endpoint on the server to retrieve data, and then client-side JavaScript and DOM manipulation. Those are all key elements to an Ajax application, and this is all built using straight JavaScript and XML/HTTP request without any libraries.